Next, let's talk about the different ways that elements will display by default and how that will affect the way that we can size and space elements. So by default, certain elements display inline, whereas other elements may display block. Elements that display inline will appear side by side, and unfortunately they won't be able to accept a width or a top and bottom margin. Elements that display block will always display one on top of the other, meaning vertically. Also, their width will automatically take up the whole line if it's not specified, and they're also able to have a top and a bottom margin. Now, we can also set elements to display inline dash block and also table and table cell, among others. But we're just going to focus on these few to start off with. So here's a simple example where I have two divs and two spans, and inside of them I've labeled A, B, C, and D. And here I've set the divs to have a blue background color and the spans to have a pink background color. And you'll notice that the divs, by default, they automatically display block in the browser. So certain elements are always just going to display block unless you specify otherwise. Some examples of other elements that you've seen that display block are things like paragraphs and headings, among others. So here A is stacked above B simply because it's displaying block. And because I haven't specified a width, you'll notice that block level elements will expand 100% unless you tell them otherwise. You'll notice that it's quite a different situation for the spans. So spans are also containers, but these display inline by default. So here we can see inline elements will display harmoniously side by side on the same line. So the way I think about it is that block level elements are kind of like selfish, greedy kings of the horizontal space, and the inline elements are like friendly hippies that will hang out next to each other side by side. Now you'll notice that the spans are just going to be as wide as the content that's inside of them. In fact, what's even stranger is if I specify a width to an element such as a span that displays inline, it will actually ignore the width. So here I'm telling these spans to be 200 pixels, and if I click run, it's just ignoring that. Again, inline level elements are going to only be as wide as the content. Additionally, you'll notice that I have 10 pixels of margin set on these inline elements, and you'll notice that we are seeing the 10 pixels here on the sides, but not above and below. So inline level elements can exist harmoniously side by side with other elements, and these are things such as the A tag for links and images using the img tag, for example, are inline elements, as are spans, and then divs, headings, and paragraphs, among others, display block and appear one on top of the other. So again, block level elements can have margin on all sides. They can have a width specified, as you can see here if I set this one to have a width. Whereas the inline level elements cannot have a width specified and will ignore margin on the top and bottom. It's also worth noting one strange thing is that for the block level elements, when we set a margin, the margin on the top and bottom are combining. So here on the div, we have a margin of 10 pixels all around. And if we zoom in here, maybe it'll be a little bit clearer. So here, this A block here has a margin of 10 pixels below, and this B block has a margin of 10 pixels above. And instead of combining into 20 pixels of margin, they actually overlap each other. So we're only seeing 10 pixels of margin in between and not 20. Now on the inline level elements, we are seeing a margin on the left and right. You'll notice that those margins are not overlapping. And in fact, on these inline level elements, the left and right margin are actually combining, and we're seeing 20 pixels, 10 pixels for the C and 10 pixels for the D. Now in CSS, we do have the display property, which will allow us to set the way elements display, overriding their defaults. So if I want, I can make a div behave like a span or make a span behave like a div simply by setting its display. So here I'll set the div to display inline, And as soon as I do that, you'll notice that it will snap side by side with the other inline elements. And here, if I set the span to display block, you'll notice that they begin to appear with a width, with margin above and below, and are now stacking vertically one on top of the other. In addition to block and inline, we also have the ability to set things to display inline dash block. Now, inline dash block is kind of like if a block level element and an inline element had a baby together, and it had some of the characteristics of each. So you can see that if I set these guys to inline dash block, then they're able to appear side by side with each other. And they're also able to have the margin on the top and bottom and a width specified. Now, in addition to inline block, we also have the ability to display things as table and table cell. Let's take a look at table cell. So here you'll see that table cell does not have the ability to have a margin on the sides. What it's doing is it's trying to make these elements act like they are the cells of a table, in fact. And also, if we remove the width setting on the table cells, you'll notice that they will simply just collapse to the size of the content. So if we're creating a page layout, and we would like to specify a width, and we would also like to be able to have margin or spacing between the elements, you might think that inline dash block would be the way to go to create column structure. But it turns out there's some funny things that happen here. For example, you'll see here that because the amount of padding inside these elements between the divs and the spans are different, what you'll notice is that this element is not aligning with either the bottom or the top of this other column properly. For this reason, we have a different strategy altogether for creating column structure in a traditional layout, and that is by setting elements to display block, but then using another property such as floating to get them to position side by side.